James Monroe, the fourth of the first 5 presidents to hail from Virginia, was born in 1758. His family was not wealthy. They were middle-class tobacco farmers. Monroe interrupted his college studies to join the Revolution in Washington's army. He was wounded in the Battle of Trenton. The great turning point in his life came after the end of the war, almost by accident, through the study of law and his Virginia contacts. Curator of the Monroe home, James Wooten.
The governor happened to be a fellow named Jefferson, and it was from the very early association, really first association of mentor and student, that the lifetime friendship between Jefferson and Monroe evolved. And it was largely, though not entirely, largely the result of the friendship between the two men that gave Monroe entree into areas that he probably would not have had access to otherwise.
Monroe studied law under Thomas Jefferson and became his aide when Jefferson was governor. Monroe's eyes were set on politics. He served in various state and federal positions, including Secretary of State and Secretary of War. In 1816, Monroe won the presidency, the last Revolutionary War officer to ascend to the nation's highest office. He traveled widely.
One of Monroe's goals in taking these presidential tours was certainly to inspect the cities that he was visiting and to chart the health of the economy and of the growth of the cities in the United States, but also to present himself to the public as their figure of a national leader, of their national leader.
Monroe supported the westward pioneers and acquired vast western lands, including parts of the Oregon Territory. During this period, American Indians would pay a heavy price as they were displaced from their land. Goods were once again flowing back and forth to Europe, and Americans were becoming increasingly self-sufficient. It was the era of good feeling. Factories sprang up throughout the Northeast. Cotton was flourishing in the South. Construction of the Erie Canal had begun, and Monroe was riding a wave of popularity.
Very early, a Boston newspaper dubbed his administration the era of good feelings. It was an era, however, that was not devoid of less than successful times.
By 1819, depression had set in. It was the worst in the nation's short history. It lasted for 2 years, and antagonism between North and South over the dark issue of slavery made it a time of growing division. The era of good feeling was ending in sectionalism. Still unopposed in his re-election bid, Monroe began a second term as president in 1820. But there was no escaping the slavery issue. It would dominate his second term. A rancorous and vindictive debate was underway in Congress. It began when Missouri asked to come into the nation as a slave state. The problem was the nation was split. There were 11 slave states and 11 free states. The nation was on the brink of civil war when, in March of 1820, a compromise was reached, the Missouri Compromise. Maine would be admitted as a free state, and Missouri would be admitted as a slave state. But no slaves would be allowed north of Missouri's border, leaving Missouri surrounded by free states. Monroe didn't like slavery, but felt powerless to do much about it. Although he thought the Missouri Compromise was illegal, he thought it more prudent to avoid civil war, and he signed the compromise into law. It wasn't a solution, but it did delay the slavery issue from coming to a head for another generation. And the nation continued to grow. In 1790, there had not been one stretch of hard surface road in the United States. By 1820, there were more than 9,000 miles of hard surface laid down. And in the next 40 years, pioneer road builders would complete 88,000 miles of road. But troubles were brewing. the young United States felt threatened by the great imperial powers, namely Spain and Russia. In the far west, Russia had established fur trading posts along the Pacific in the Oregon Territory, and the European powers were trying to establish footholds in Latin America. In 1823, Monroe put his foot down. While at his Oak Hill estate near Leesburg, Virginia, he wrote what was to become one of the cornerstones of American foreign policy, the Monroe Doctrine. It declared to the world that the American continent was no longer open to European colonization, that foreign powers should not meddle in the affairs of the Western Hemisphere. In return, Monroe pledged not to interfere in European affairs. It was a simple but strong message, signaling the beginning of America's status as a world power and the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere. The doctrine was considered by some to be the legacy of Monroe's presidency, but not all view it as Monroe's most important achievement.
To me, Monroe's greater contribution as a president was to bring about the role of administrator in the presidency, and to bring about in the presidency also a sense of the president as a truly national leader, a united national leader.
Monroe also asserted America's economic rights. When the English attempted to undersell U.S.-made goods, he responded with the Protective Tariff Act in 1824. The act charged high duties on imports of manufactured goods. Both Northerners and Southerners went along with the act. America was, for the time being, unified in its quest to make the country economically independent of Europe. Like other presidents before him, Monroe found himself in dire financial straits when he left the White House. Forced to sell his beloved Virginia home, Monroe spent his last years with his daughter and in-laws in New York City. He died on July 4th, 1831, the third of the first 5 presidents to die on Independence Day.
In 25, 58 years old, from Virginia.
Monroe's a relic. He's the last of the revolutionary generation to hold high office. He's the last of the Virginia dynasty.
In person, he cut the figure of the quintessential hero of the Revolution, from his boots, breeches, and ceremonial sword, right up to his cockade hat.
The funny thing about James Monroe is that no one ever seems to have thought terribly well of him, except his character. Everybody said he was honest, and everybody said he was trustworthy. But no one ever said he was extremely intelligent. Yet this man must have been doing something right, because he gets elected twice to the presidency by crushing margins.
Monroe's presidency was so seemingly amicable that he was unopposed when he ran for his second term.
He had, in many ways, a falsely easy presidency. This is supposed to be the era of good feelings. He seems to reign over a period of peace and happiness in America.
But not really. Because if you look just underneath the surface, you have Monroe presiding, but he's presiding over lots of stuff that's going on behind the doors.
Monroe's management style reflected his personality. He was a hands-off executive who hired great people for his cabinet, then delegated authority. This served him well during the moments that defined his presidency. At the beginning of Monroe's first term, the territory of Missouri petitioned for statehood. In theory, adding a star to the flag should have been cause for national celebration. Instead, it ignited a great political debate over slavery. Would Missouri be a free or slave state? As Congress debated the explosive issue, Monroe, a slave owner himself, made it clear that he would veto any legislation that restricted self-determination for any state. Eventually, Congress passed the Missouri Compromise of 1820.
Missouri enters the Union. as a slave state. Maine enters the Union as a free state. And prohibitions are put upon the expansion of slavery. It is a temporary solution.
Monroe also came up with his own plan. He proposed to return slaves to Africa. Called the American Colonization Society, this led to the founding of Monrovia, Liberia, the only foreign capital to be named for a U.S. president. Unfortunately, this did little to solve the crisis at home. While the slavery question simmered, Monroe faced a border crisis in Florida. The territory was still owned by Spain, but the Spanish did little to govern it.
It's a nest of pirates and outlaws, and there are Indian tribes who live there who are certainly not under the control of the Spanish government.
By 1818, border incursions were common. Seminole Indians, in particular, were raiding white settlements in Georgia. These raids were often encouraged by British privateers who operated on the Florida coast. In response, Monroe sent troops to the region, led by the hero of New Orleans, General Andrew Jackson.
Andrew Jackson ends up being sick and tired of it, and he invades Florida and captures the British and hangs them. So he creates an international incident involving 3 countries, the United States, Spain, and Britain.
Jackson's raid caused an uproar in Monroe's cabinet. Some, including Secretary of War John C. Calhoun, wanted to reprimand the general.
And Secretary of State John Quincy Adams sticks up for him. He says what the British were doing was outrageous and the Spaniards ought to have stopped them, and they didn't. And Jackson did a preemptive strike, and that's what he ought to have done.
Monroe did not reprimand Jackson. Instead, he opened negotiations with Spain for the rights to the territory. In 1819, the Spanish ceded Florida to the United States without a fight. Border disputes were constant during Monroe's tenure. Significantly, it was a border issue that led to Monroe's defining moment in office. In December 1823, the president delivered a message to Congress and to the world. Ostensibly, he addressed a minor dispute between Russia and the United States over Alaska. But the speech contained a short paragraph that became his legacy. It stated, "The American continents are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers."
The Monroe Doctrine is our statement that we reject European countries coming in and trying to acquire further territorial gains in this hemisphere. You stay in your hemisphere, we'll stay in ours.
It wasn't until 1852 that people began calling it the Monroe Doctrine. By then, it was regarded as Monroe's greatest moment. And yet, he was not the true author.
That's a wonderful example of how the presidency is becoming the central branch of the government. And the president is becoming so important. The Monroe Doctrine is written by John Quincy Adams, Secretary of State. But because it happens in Monroe's administration, it's known as the Monroe Doctrine.
The end of James Monroe's presidency was a turning point in American political history. He was the last of the revolutionary generation, the last of the architects of the American Republic.
These men were not politicians. Their vision of themselves was as caretakers of and leaders of a nation, as good citizens, as statesmen. And I think that maybe marks the difference between the generation of Jefferson and Adams and the generation of Andrew Jackson and the men who come after.